Chapter 46 of the Prime Minister. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicholas Clifford. The Prime Minister by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 46. He Wants to Get Rich Too Quick. As they strolled home, Lopez told his wife that he had accepted an invitation to dine the next day at the Parkers' cottage. In doing this his manner was not quite so gentle as when he had asked her to call on them. He had been a little ruffled by what had been said, and now exhibited his temper. "I don't suppose it will be very nice," he said, "but we may have to put up with worse things than that." "I have made no objection." "But you don't seem to take to it very cordially." "I had thought that I got on very well with Mrs. Parker. If you can eat your dinner with them, I'm sure that I can. You do not seem to like him altogether, and I wish you had got a partner more to your taste." "Taste, indeed! When you come to this kind of thing it isn't a matter of taste. The fact is that I am in that fellow's hands to an extent I don't like to think of, and don't see my way out of it unless your father will do as he ought to do. You altogether refuse to help me with your father, and you must therefore put up with Sexty Parker and his wife. It is quite on the cards that worse things may come even than Sexty Parker." To this she made no immediate answer, but walked on, increasing her pace, not only unhappy, but also very angry. It was becoming a matter of doubt to her whether she could continue to bear these repeated attacks about her father's money. "I see how it is," he continued. "You think that a husband should bear all the troubles of life, and that a wife should never be made to hear of them." "Ferdinand," she said, "I declare I did not think that any man could be so unfair to a woman as you are to me." "Of course, because I haven't got thousands a year to spend on you, I am unfair." "I am content to live in any way that you may direct. If you are poor, I am satisfied to be poor. If you are even ruined, I am content to be ruined." "Who is talking about ruin?" "If you are in want of everything, I also will be in want and will never complain. Whatever our joint lot may bring to us I will endure, and will endeavour to endure with cheerfulness. But I will not ask my father for money either for you or for myself. He knows what he ought to do. I trust him implicitly." "And me not at all." "He is, I know, in communication with you about what should be done. I can only say, tell him everything." "My dear, that is a matter in which it may be possible that I understand my own interest best." "Very likely. I certainly understand nothing, for I do not even know the nature of your business. How can I tell him that he ought to give you money?" "You might ask him for your own." "I have got nothing. Did I ever tell you that I had?" "You ought to have known." "Do you mean that when you asked me to marry you I should have refused you because I did not know what money papa would give me? Why did you not ask papa?" "Had I known him then as well as I do now, you may be quite sure that I should have done so." "Ferdinand, it will be better that we should not speak about my father. I will in all things strive to do as you would have me, but I cannot hear him abused. If you have anything to say, go to Everett." "Yes, when he is such a gambler that your father won't even speak to him. Your father will be found dead in his bed some day, and all his money will have been left to some cursed hospital." They were at their own door when this was said, and she, without further answer, went up to her bedroom. All these bitter things had been said, not because Lopez had thought that he could further his own views by saying them. He knew indeed that he was injuring himself by every display of ill temper. But she was in his power, and Sexty Parker was rebelling. He thought a good deal that day on the delight he would have in kicking that ill-conditioned cur, if only he could afford to kick him. But his wife was his own, and she must be taught to endure his will, and must be made to know that though she was not to be kicked, yet she was to be tormented and ill-used. And it might be possible that he should so cow her spirit as to bring her to act as he should direct. Still, as he walked alone along the seashore, he knew that it would be better for him to control his temper. On that evening he did write to Mr. Wharton as follows, and he dated his letter from Little Tankard Yard, so that Mr. Wharton might suppose that that really was his own place of business, and that he was there at his work. My dear Sir, you have asked for a schedule of my affairs, and I have found it quite impossible to give it. As it was with the merchants whom Shakespeare and the other dramatists described, so it is with me. My caravels are out at sea, and will not always come home in time. My property at the moment consists of certain shares of cargoes of jute, Kauri gum, guano, and sulphur, worth altogether at the present moment something over £26,000, of which Mr. Parker possesses the half. But then of this property only a portion is paid for, perhaps something more than half. For the other half our bills are in the market. But in February next these articles will probably be sold for considerably more than £30,000. If I had £5,000 placed to my credit now, I should be worth about £15,000 by the end of next February. I am engaged in sundry other smaller ventures, all returning profits, but in such a condition of things it is impossible that I should make a schedule. I am undoubtedly in the condition of a man trading beyond his capital. I have been tempted by fair offers, and what I think I may call something beyond an average understanding of such matters, to go into ventures beyond my means. I have stretched my arm out too far. In such a position it is not perhaps unnatural that I should ask a wealthy father-in-law to assist me. It is certainly not unnatural that I should wish him to do so. I do not think that I am a mercenary man. When I married your daughter I raised no question as to her fortune. Being embarked in trade, I no doubt thought that her means, whatever they might be, would be joined to my own. I know that a sum of £20,000, with my experience in the use of money, would give us a noble income. But I would not condescend to ask a question which might lead to a supposition that I was marrying her for her money, and not because I loved her. You know now, I think, all that I can tell you. If there be any other questions, I would willingly answer them. It is certainly the case that Emily's fortune, whatever you may choose to give her, would be of infinitely greater use to me now, and consequently to her, than at a future date, which I sincerely pray may be very long deferred. Believe me to be your affectionate son-in-law, Ferdinand Lopez. A. Wharton, Esquire. This letter he himself took up to town on the following day, and there posted, addressing it to Wharton Hall. He did not expect very great results from it. As he read it over he was painfully aware that all his trash about caravels and cargoes of sulphur would not go far with Mr. Wharton. But it might go farther than nothing. He was bound not to neglect Mr. Wharton's letter to him. When a man is in difficulty about money, even a lie that is sure to be found out to be a lie, will serve his immediate turn better than silence. There is nothing that the courts hate so much as contempt, not even perjury. And Lopez felt that Mr. Wharton was the judge before whom he was bound to plead. He returned to Dovercourt on that day, and he and his wife dined with the Parkers. No woman of her age had known better what were the manners of ladies and gentlemen than Emily Wharton. She had thoroughly understood that when in Herefordshire she was surrounded by people of that class, and that when she was with her aunt, Mrs. Roby, she was not quite so happily placed. No doubt she had been terribly deceived by her husband, but the deceit had come from the fact that his manners gave no indication of his character. When she found herself in Mrs. Parker's little sitting room, with Mr. Parker making florid speeches to her, she knew that she had fallen among people for whose society she had not been intended. But this was a part, and only a very trifling part, of the punishment which she felt that she deserved. If that, and all things like that, were all, she could bear them all without a murmur. "Now I call Dovercourt a deuced nice little place," said Mr. Parker, as he helped her to the bit of fish which he told her he had brought down with him from London. "It is very healthy, I should think." "Just the thing for the children, ma'am. You've none of your own, Mrs. Lopez, but there's a good time coming. You were up to-day, weren't you, Lopez? Any news?" "Things seem to be very quiet in the city." "Too quiet, I'm afraid. I hate having 'em quiet. You must come and see me in Little Tankard Yard some of these days, Mrs. Lopez. We can give you a glass of sham and the wing of a chicken, can't we, Lopez?" "I don't know. It's more than you ever gave me," said Lopez, trying to look good-humoured. "But you ain't a lady." "Or me," said Mrs. Parker. "You're only a wife. If Mrs. Lopez will make a day of it, we'll treat her well in the city. Won't we, Ferdinand?" A black cloud came across Ferdinand's face, but he said nothing. Emily of a sudden drew herself up unconsciously, then at once relaxed her features and smiled. If her husband chose that it should be so, she would make no objection. "Upon my honour, Sexty, you are very familiar," said Mrs. Parker. "It's a way we have in the city," said Sexty. Sexty knew what he was about. His partner called him Sexty, and why shouldn't he call his partner Ferdinand? "He'll call you Emily before long," said Lopez. "When you call my wife Jane, I shall, and I've no objection in life. I don't see why people ain't to call each other by their Christian names. Take a glass of champagne, Mrs. Lopez. I brought down half a dozen today so that we might be jolly. Care killed a cat. Whatever we call each other, I'm very glad to see you here, Mrs. Lopez, and I hope it's the first of a great many. Here's your health." It was all his ordering, and if he bade her dine with a crossing sweeper she would do it. But she could not but remember that not long since he had told her that his partner was not a person with whom she could fitly associate, and she did not fail to perceive that he must be going down in the world to admit such association for her after he had so spoken. And as she sipped the mixture which Sexty called champagne, she thought of Herefordshire and the banks of the Wye, and, alas, alas, she thought of Arthur Fletcher. Nevertheless, come what might, she would do her duty, even though it might call upon her to sit at dinner with Mr. Parker 3 days in the week. Lopez was her husband, and would be the father of her child, and she would make herself one with him. It mattered not what people might call him, or even her. She had acted on her own judgment in marrying him, and had been a fool, and now she would bear the punishment without complaint. When dinner was over, Mrs. Parker helped the servant to remove the dinner things from the single sitting room, and the two men went out to smoke their cigars in the covered porch. Mrs. Parker herself took out the whisky and hot water, and sugar and lemons, and then returned to have a little matronly discourse with her guest. "Does Mr. Lopez ever take a drop too much?" she asked. "Never," said Mrs. Lopez. "Perhaps it don't affect him as it do Sexty. He ain't a drinker, certainly not, and he's one that works hard every day of his life. But he's getting fond of it these last 12 months, and though he don't take very much, it hurries him and flurries him. If I speaks at night he gets cross, and in the morning when he gets up, which he always do regular, though it's ever so bad with him, then I haven't the heart to scold him. It's very hard sometimes for a wife to know what to do, Mrs. Lopez." Yes, indeed. Emily could not but think how soon she herself had learned that lesson. "Of course I'd do anything for Sexty, the father of my bairns, and has always been a good husband to me. You don't know him, of course, but I do. A right good man at bottom, but so weak." If he injures his health, shouldn't you talk to him quietly about it?" "It isn't the drink as is the evil, Mrs. Lopez, but that which makes him drink. He's not one as goes a mucker merely for the pleasure. When things are going right he'll sit out in our arbour at home and smoke pipe after pipe, playing with the children, and one glass of gin and water cold will see him to bed. Tobacco, dry, do agree with him, I think. But when he comes to 3 or 4 goes of hot toddy, I know it's not as it should be." "You should restrain him, Mrs. Parker." "Of course I should, but how? Am I to walk off with a bottle and disgrace him before the servant girl? Or am I to let the children know as their father takes too much? If I was as much as to make one fight of it, it would be all over Ponder's End that he's a drunkard, which he ain't. Restrain him, oh yes. If I could restrain that gambling instead of regular business, that's what I'd like to restrain." "Does he gamble?" "What is it but gambling that he and Mr. Lopez is a doing together? Of course, ma'am, I don't know you, and you are different from me. I ain't foolish enough not to know all that. My father stood in Smithfield and sold hay, and your father is a gentleman as has been high up in the courts all his life. But it's your husband is a doing this." "Oh, Mrs. Parker!" "He is then, and if he brings Sexty and my little ones to the workhouse, what'll be the good then of his guano and his gum?" "Is it not all in the fair way of commerce?" "I'm sure I don't know about commerce, Mrs. Lopez, because I'm only a woman. But it can't be fair. They goes and buys things they haven't got the money to pay for, and then waits to see if they'll turn up trumps. Isn't that gambling?" "I cannot say. I do not know." She felt now that her husband had been accused, and that part of the accusation had been levelled at herself. There was something in her manner of saying these few words which the poor complaining woman perceived, feeling immediately that she had been inhospitable and perhaps unjust. She put out her hand softly, touching the other woman's arm and looking up into her guest's face. "If this is so, it is terrible," said Emily. "Perhaps I oughtn't to speak so free." "Oh yes, for your children and yourself and your husband." "It's them and him. Of course it's not your doing, and Mr. Lopez, I'm sure, is a very fine gentleman, and if he gets wrong one way he'll get himself right in another." Upon hearing this Emily shook her head. "Your papa is a rich man and won't see you and yours come to want. There's nothing more to come to me or Sexty, let it be ever so." "Why does he do it?" "Why does who do it?" "Your husband. Why don't you speak to him as you do to me, and tell him to mind only his proper business?" "Now you are angry with me." "Angry? No, indeed, I am not angry. Every word that you say is good and true, and just what you ought to say. I am not angry, but I am terrified. I know nothing of my husband's business. I cannot tell you that you should trust to it. He is very clever, but—" "But what, ma'am?" "Perhaps I should say that he is ambitious." "You mean he wants to get rich too quick, ma'am." "I'm afraid so." "Then it's just the same with Sexty. He's ambitious too. But what's the good of being ambitious, Mrs. Lopez, if you never know whether you're on your head or your heels? And what's the good of being ambitious if you're to get sent into the workhouse? I know what that means. There's one or two of them sort of men gets into Parliament and has houses as big as the Queen's palace, while hundreds of them has their wives and children in the gutter. Who ever hears of them? Nobody. It don't become any man to be ambitious who has got a wife and family. If he's a bachelor, why, of course, he can go to the colonies. There's Mary Jane and the two little ones right down on the sea with their feet in the salt water. Shall we put on our hats, Mrs. Lopez, and go and look after them?" To this proposition Emily assented, and the two ladies went out after the children. "Mix yourself another glass," said Sexty to his partner. "I'd rather not. Don't ask me again. You know I never drink, and I don't like being pressed." "By George, you are particular." "What's the use of teasing a fellow to do a thing he doesn't like?" "You won't mind me having another?" "50, if you please, so that I'm not forced to join you." "Forced! It's liberty all here, and you can do as you please. Only when a fellow will take a drop with me, he's better company." "Then I'm bad company, and you'd better get somebody else to be jolly with. To tell you the truth, Sexty, I suit you better at business than at this sort of thing. I'm like Shylock, you know." "I don't know about Shylock, but I'm blessed if I think you suit me very well at anything. I'm putting up with a deal of ill usage, and when I try to be happy with you, you won't drink, and you tell me about Shylock. He was a Jew, wasn't he?" "That is the general idea." "Then you ain't very much like him, for they're a sort of people that always have money about 'em." "How do you suppose he made his money to begin with? What an ass you are!" "That's true. I am. Ever since I began putting my name on the same bit of paper with yours, I've been an ass." "You'll have to be one a bit longer yet, unless you mean to throw up everything. At this present moment you are £6,000 or £7,000 richer than you were before you first met me." "I wish I could see the money." "That's like you. What's the use of money you can see? How are you to make money out of money by looking at it? I like to know that my money is fructifying." "I like to know that it's all there, and I did know it before I ever saw you. I'm blessed if I know it now. Go down and join the ladies, will you? You ain't much of a companion up here." Shortly after that Lopez told Mrs. Parker that he had already bade adieu to her husband, and then he took his wife to their own lodgings. CHAPTER XLVII.